Joining us now on The Debate in Washington, D.C., Brian Grimm, researcher from the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life. In our nation's capital, Alex Neve, Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada. And with us here in studio, Don Hutchinson, Vice President of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, Wahida Valianti, founding member of the Canadian Islamic Congress, and Clifford Orwin, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. And it's good to have you three around this table here, and to our friends out of town, we're glad you could join us as well. As we suggested in the opening, Stephen Harper, when he was running for re-election last spring, made this promise in his re-election bid, an office of religious freedom within the Department of Foreign Affairs, and now he is fulfilling that promise. And Don, why don't I start with you? Just give us a sense of what you see the mission of this office being.
I really see the mission of the office helping to coordinate the fact that roughly 70% of the Earth's population faces either social conflict or some form of oppression for religious reasons. And this office will help the Canadian government to stay informed in all of our dealings with the foreign nations, whether we're going through foreign affairs or international trade in those relationships, when we're determining seated funding through the International Cooperation Ministry, and when people are coming to Canada through citizenship and immigration. It is very helpful to have some best practices in play to help with understanding refugee claims.
Let me go to the other side of the table. Wahida, when you first heard about this promise from Stephen Harper, what did you think of it?
The question was that we already have in our foreign policy, Charter of Rights, all of these elements that you have just mentioned in place, and have been using them judiciously over the years, depending, of course, on the political situation. But nonetheless, it's so hidden and it's so secretive that the second thought is, why are we doing this then? What exactly is the agenda?
More to come on that as we go through this. Alex Neve in Ottawa, why don't you tell us what your reaction was when you first heard of the government's plans?
Well, certainly we had a very positive reaction. Religious freedom is an essential human right for Amnesty International. Religious persecution has been at the heart of our human rights work for over 50 years now. We had some questions and cautionary notes that came to mind. Certainly, foremost was to ensure that it would go forward within a rights framework, recognizing the ways in which freedom of religion has a very important and sometimes contentious relationship with a lot of other essential rights.
Clifford Orwin, your reaction when you first heard?
I too am quite favorable. The Charter of Rights is a domestic charter. This puts religious freedom firmly on the agenda for our foreign policy. And that, it seems to me, is perfectly appropriate. I'd like to say, by the way, that in my understanding, there can be no conflict between religious freedom and other basic liberal freedoms, because they're a bundle. And
hold that thought. We are going to come back to that later, later in the program. I do want to say to Brian, yes, Americans do get to talk on this program, and we want to hear from you now. I don't know if the news filtered down to the United States that Canada was in fact setting up an office like this, but what are your impressions of it based on what you know?
Well, yeah, the news did make it down south of the border. And one of my impressions is that there seems to be a growing interest in addressing issues related to freedom of religion or belief around the world. And many governments are trying to address this, some that you've mentioned, but also there have been various proposals by other governments trying to look at issues related to religious discrimination, religious violence, and harassment of religious groups around the world. So I saw this, at least from my perspective, as part of a trend that's happening globally.
Don, I wonder if you could address Wahida's point, which is, I think, we have a lot of these bases covered already. Why do we need this in addition to what we already have? What's the answer to that?
I think the reality is that the bases are not covered as well as they might be. We're dealing with a situation where Canada has been caught off guard, as have other governments, by the religious nature of certain governments in other parts of the world, and where the persecution of religious groups, whether they're Christian or minority Muslim communities or other faith communities, the Baha'i as well, has been something that hasn't been high on the radar for Canadian diplomats to be concerned about.
Wahida, does that help you at all?
Not really, not to that extent, simply because the evolution of our thinking as where we are today it ought to be in the context of changing perceptions, by the way. And when I say perceptions, I'm not saying just airy-fairy kind of a thing, because we have created an environment within our own society where we look at the others. And I think that is quite a different agenda than it has been over the years since I've been here since 1961. And I ought to know that our policies have always promoted same rights as Canadian values that we call democracy, freedom to practice religion and speech. So I just have and obviously nobody gonna disagree with that we should promote religious freedom. No, I mean, this is a basic premises, and nobody gonna argue against that. The question is why now, what exactly we're going to accomplish, and why there is such a secrecy that there has been no discussions. And you're excluding a large segment of the population in the discourse that has been going on.
Just before we go to that, Wahida, that we do want to unpack those themes as we go along here, but I want to share some numbers that Brian put together, his organization in Washington. This is a country-by-country look at which groups, from say mid-2006 to 2009, in which groups in how many countries are the most persecuted around the world. And Brian's organization puts at the top of the list Christians, who in 130 countries around the world are the most persecuted. Muslims come second. Others, which would include Sikhs, Zoroastrians, and the Baha'i faith, come next. Jews come next, then Hindus, and then Buddhists. Now, Brian, that's sort of the lay of the land. Maybe you could help us out by telling us how you collected those statistics to begin with.
Yeah, well, the numbers that you're citing are the number of countries where we found cases of either governments harassing religious groups or members of society or groups within society harassing groups. So it's not an exact measure of who is the most persecuted, but it does give an indication of the extent to which religious groups around the world have faced some sort of problem. So we don't actually have numbers of every case in each country, but we know that at least some problems have existed in this number of countries. And one of the findings that we've found is that often it's the minority groups within countries that are facing problems. So say unpacking the Muslim number a bit, where we found problems in 117 countries, often it may be the Sunnis, for instance, in Iran, which is a Shia majority country, facing a problem, or conversely, it could be the Shia in Saudi Arabia who are facing the problems because Saudi Arabia is Sunni majority.
Now, Christians at the top of the list, Don, that is one of the criticisms one hears from the American experience with this. Bill Clinton, when he was president, set up a similar structure in the American government. We hear that the office is too much focused on Christians and not enough on other faiths. Fair criticism?
Well, the office doesn't exist yet. And I think the minister has indicated that there will be a unique Canadian solution to dealing with religious freedom. And part of that has been a very broad consultation with many faith communities, both in Canada and on foreign soil, to have those conversations.
Just to clarify, though, I know the Canadian office hasn't been set up yet, but that is the criticism south of the border, that it's become simply, we worry about the Christians, and that's the thing we worry about the most.
And certainly, I think that was one of the advantages of having Tom Farr come up from the United States to participate in one of the consultations that took place, the one in Ottawa in October. I know that there's been some media criticism that what's taking place has been secretive.
No, not just media. I think we heard Wahida say it too.
And we heard Wahida say it too. But the reality is, when the government has a consultation, and it was the same with the Liberal government before it and the Progressive Conservative before that, people are invited to the consultation. It takes place in a room. It has a capacity. The doors are closed. In this instance, there have been consultations in various parts of the country. That was, pardon me, that was the main one in Ottawa. And there have been consultations with people in other countries as well with the minister. So I think they're engaging in a broad process, but it can easily be framed as closed if you feel perhaps that you weren't there, or if there's concern that your group wasn't represented well enough.
More on this in a second. Go ahead, Wahida.
The statistics, if you should look at the number of Muslims, both Shia and Sunni, in Canada, And we have had only one representation last week. I think it was Tuesday, Wednesday. He got a call at 4 o'clock. You have to ask that question, why is this? Because we had every other, we had Baha'i, we had the Ismailis, and we had a number of others. And there was no consultations with this the two large groups. And we have enough people go around, you know, there's the imams who've been involved in that. Why there was no consultation? All of a sudden there's some sort of a kind of secondary thought comes in, okay, we're gonna call this person and just quickly. I don't think so that we can hide that under the carpet. There is a flaw in this process. I think that needs to be really addressed.
Clifford, can I get you to address that? Does this thing lack a legitimacy that it needs to be effective if there was a closed-door meeting to which many different groups were not invited?
Yes, I agree that that's a problem. I think that the consultative net has to be spread as widely as possible. And it was getting the office off on the wrong foot, right, by not recognizing that fact. On the other hand, I want to make the point that although we certainly want to do things in a Canadian way here in Canada, I think of multiculturalism in principle as something of a red herring, because religious freedom was from the very beginning multicultural. It was always freedom of tolerant religion as such, not of this or that tolerant religion. And Locke, the great founder of this way of thinking, writing already in 1680, albeit anonymously, argued that even idolatry ought to be tolerated, you know, so long as the idolatry is itself tolerant. So that, I think, has been the spirit, the true spirit of freedom of religion from the beginning. And therefore, it jibes very well with Canadian multiculturalism.
Alex, from what you know about this, has the lack of consultation, as Wahida suggests, been a problem in making this office as legitimate as, you know, the government would like it to be?
I think it has been problematic, and I think it's both about reality and perception here, given that in early stages we haven't seen a great degree of openness and transparency. And that doesn't mean everyone needs to be in the room. Clearly that's an impossibility. But the degree to which it's even been difficult to get clarity around who is in the room, some public indication of who's involved in the consultation sessions, and some public access perhaps to discussion papers and things that are starting to develop. The fact that that has been so problematic, I think, is fueling concern that the office as it goes forward may not be as broadly inclusive as it needs to be. And opening it up in a much greater way would really help dispel some of that. And I think it's also important to note here, this isn't only about making sure that all faith groups are having access to and being able to follow the consultations. There's other communities, the human rights community, women's equality, lesbian and gay groups. There's a lot of other organizations that have some direct interests and rights at stake as this goes forward, and there needs to be a real focus on bringing them in.
Brian, when you set up the American office, were all of those groups in on the ground floor to help it have the legitimacy that obviously governments would like these organizations to have?
Well, I should say that I wasn't part of setting it up, and I'm not part of the U.S. government. So I'm speaking from a information initiative project called the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life. And we're funded independently by the Pew Charitable Trust and the John Templeton Foundation. So I can offer an outsider's perspective on how the office has operated. You're right that some of the early concerns and criticisms were that it was focused primarily on problems of Christians, and some of the early causes was the civil war in Sudan, and that was very prominent in some of the discussions. But I can, as an observer and seeing the activities that they do, and especially the reports that are put out each year by the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom, it gives a picture of who they're focusing on. And I read these reports cover to cover from every year, as well as a whole team of researchers that I supervise to pull out cases that are happening around the world. And so many of the cases that are mentioned of Muslims facing problems around the world come from State Department reports. And I think it would be fair to say that as the State Department's International Religious Freedom reports try to report on problems, they do it from A to Z, from Ahmadiyya Muslims to Zoroastrians. And that's been my impression. But in any human endeavor, biases are always possible. Humans fail. But in the reports, and that's what I can judge by because I look at them very carefully, they do try to find any problem a religious group is facing, as well as people that may be trying to hold no belief or a divergent belief from the majority belief, and trying to take up their cause.
Okay, Clifford, let me ask you to follow up on something that Don said earlier, which is that John Baird, the Foreign Affairs Minister, when he made this announcement that it's going to happen, but he said we're going to take a Canadian approach to fighting for religious freedom around the world. What do you think a Canadian approach to this means?
Well, first of all, it means a rather small-scale approach, since we're a rather small country and we're devoting only a rather small proportion of our resources to it.
It's a $5 million budget in the office, right?
Yes.
So not that big.
Yeah, so it's, given the amount of religious strife and persecution in the world, it's a drop in the bucket. So obviously, we would have to choose our cases carefully, and we would have to coordinate, I think, our efforts with the efforts of other offices. And also a point that's been made by Mr. Neve to coordinate our defense of religious rights with our defense of other liberal rights. And this was also a point that was made by Michael Ignatieff in his comment to the original announcement, because generally speaking in the world, religious persecution is accompanied by other forms of persecution. It's often, for instance, at the same time, ethnic strife and, of course, political strife. So it's complicated, and one does have to choose one's cases carefully. And again, I think one would have to try to leverage to the maximum degree the efforts of this office with the efforts of other arms of Canadian policy.
Well, Don, I'm going to follow up with you because, of course, one thing that governments, regardless of their political stripe in this country, often don't want to do is look like they're piggybacking on American efforts or doing, me too. You're doing that, us too. They want to look like they're very distinctive and very uniquely Canadian in their approach. Except when the rubber hits the road, we still need to know, what's the Canadian approach to religious freedom mean?
I think the Canadian approach reflects the fact that constitutionally we're a multicultural nation. I think it was reflected by presentations and interventions that were made in the October consultation, which is the only one of the consultations in which I participated, that there were people from several faith communities indicating that we would like to see a multi-faith advisory panel composed of people from different religious communities who are engaged on the issue of religious freedom at the international level, so that we can have informed conversation and that we can provide on the ground level information to the government, in addition to the reports, et cetera, that are available from other sources.
Could you create an advisory board of religious leaders big enough to encompass all of those who would want to have a say on this?
I'm not sure it would encompass all who would want to have a say, but certainly we've been able in several communities to have multi-faith conversations, and we do have engaged in the G8 process, multi-faith consultation that parallels the G8 process and challenges the G8 leaders when they meet. And we've also got a very successful all-party interfaith group meeting on Parliament Hill to help inform parliamentarians about different faith communities. So it's possible for us to engage, but not necessarily to engage every voice that wants to be heard.
And this goes to Wahida's point, I think, which is that there are groups around the world that are under the thumb of oppression in many places and who don't necessarily get into the room to help set this thing up at the beginning. Women's groups, gays, lesbians, they have not, or I should ask, have they been there at the ground floor helping set this thing up?
I don't think so, not to my knowledge.
Do you think that's a problem?
But should be, it is a problem. So if we're going to be so inclusive, which is the Canadian way, then why those people are left out?
Well, except that they say this is an office of religious freedom.
Well, then obviously those who are gays or they're women, they are religious, they have religions. So in what categories are we going to now put them? I think that this is the confusion that more one thinks about it, is that all of a sudden we are creating some office, an expectation with this whole idea that somehow we're going to implement our Canadian values and we're going to deal with the different countries on par and going to dictate in some way, this is what we demand out of you. First of all, I think that Canada needs to go back to its roots and learn one thing very important, which we are forgetting, is that in the world, you have to have some respect and credibility, and that comes from how you behave, how you treat your own citizens. And now, if you look at in Canada, the changing environment, here we have a minister gets up and say the women cannot cover their face when they go and take an oath. Now, I mean, I'm maybe sitting in somewhere in Pakistan or somewhere. I'm going to question what is it Canada says its values, and why is this happening? Because you go to the other parts of the world, all through Middle East and that, women cover their faces, women don't cover their faces, women wear mini skirts, women don't wear mini. I mean, this is just accepted. And I grew up in England, and the diversity that I have seen there also within the Christian faith, practicing the Catholics and the Protestants.
So we're talking the talk, but we're not walking the walk.
Exactly. So this is why the dichotomy now of what we are doing and what we're going to be promoting is going to be very intense.
Alex, do you think that hamstrings the efforts of this ORF?
Well, I think these are crucial, absolutely crucial questions. I think you were asking the question as to what could be distinctly Canadian about how this office develops. I think one of the key aspects is it needs to be solidly situated in a human rights framework and recognize, obviously, first and foremost, that religious freedom is a right. That's absolutely why the office exists. But the interconnected nature of the relationship that religious freedom has with so many other rights, whether that's as religious freedom is persecuted, is violated, so too are many other rights at the same time, but also the degree to which religious freedom can in itself pose a real challenge to the rights, the equality rights, even the safety and security of a whole range of rights, from women's equality to freedom of expression. That's what is absolutely essential here.
Let me make sure I understand your point, because the government has set this up as an office of religious freedom that will do its work in the sphere of religiosity. Are you saying that it, by extension, has to also include women who are persecuted for what may not be religious reasons, but just because they're women, or gays and lesbians, not because of their religion, but because of their sexual orientation?
But if that happens in the context of religion, I think is where we need to be attentive. I mean, this is a small office that's not going to be able to do all things for all people. But if that aspect of religious freedom is overlooked and ignored, then I think the opportunity for this to go forward in a way which is distinctly Canadian, that really situates this strongly within a human rights framework and understanding, will be lost.
Brian, can I get your take on that? I want to better understand whether or not it is a dilution, if you like, of the office's mission to broaden its scope.
Well, I'm not sure I can speak directly to that, but certainly, you know, there's several principles. One is that different kinds of rights are interrelated. So, you know, there are a bundle of human rights that we usually talk about, and they usually work in tandem, and sometimes they work in conflict. So I think that whenever an endeavor is underway to try to address one right, that having to have dialogue with the other rights comes about naturally and is very important. A second point I would make is that in sociological research, we do see the correlation between the different rights. And for instance, when women's lives are bettered in a society, we see a correlation of that with higher levels of religious freedom. The causation isn't clearly understood, but you know, perhaps that is one avenue, or that's one area that is worthy of investigation. You know, how does religious freedom and women's rights relate to one another?
Clifford, let me get your view on how wide a net this office has to cast its net in order to be effective.
Well, I think that if it casts its net too widely, it will be ineffective. I think it has to have a fairly sharp focus in terms of what it does, and it has to focus on relatively few cases, because that's all that it's going to be able to handle beyond a kind of monitoring and reporting function. But I'd like to stress that, as I understand it, there's not a tension between freedom of religion and any other liberal right, because freedom of religion has never meant freedom of intolerant religion. It just hasn't. It's always meant freedom of tolerant religion, and to the extent to which religion is intolerant, it disqualifies itself, in fact, for protection under religious freedom.
Think everybody understands it that way?
I don't think everybody understands it that way, but that's the way it was certainly understood by its great founders, and that's the way that it's generally worked in practice in the West, where it's worked best, and that's the way in which people are going to have to learn to conceive it. You know, that freedom of religion simply does not mean freedom to abuse others on the basis of one's religion, either to abuse their religious rights or their rights in other respects. And that's why, generally speaking, one finds freedom of religion flourish only where one finds other liberal rights flourish. Right? They are a package, you know, they go together. That's why I would expect freedom of religion and women's rights to flourish, right, in the same society.
This could get tricky, and I want to follow up with you on this. For example, in the Jewish faith, women are not recognized as being part of the group of 10 that gathers, a minyan, in constituting a quorum to pray. Is that something this office should look into?
No, because it doesn't affect women's civic status. Right? I mean, when one talks about separation of church and state, a somewhat problematic term, but we'll work with it, what you're talking about is the fact that matters of religion don't affect one's civic status. You know, one can't abridge someone's civic status on the basis of his or her practice of religion or on the basis of his or her practice of no religion.
Do you think a Jewish woman would answer the question the same way you just did?
I would hope that a Jewish woman would. That is to say that she would understand that her fight was within Judaism in this case, not something in which she ought to bring in the state.
I see. Okay. Wahida?
I couldn't agree more, because this is really the struggle that I have, is that everything happens with the Muslim women, let's say in the context of that they can't go into the mosque and be on the same level and say that always becomes religion is bad. And I think you have clarified it so simply. That is something within the religion itself. The women have to take responsibility to bring those changes.
We don't need the government involved in that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Just one little point.
Sure.
But what about that? Where would the missionaries will fit in then, in this office? If they go and aggressively are trying to convert people for whatever means, is that also going to be a religious freedom for those who go in and say, I want to preach my religion, I want to convert people? I don't know. I mean, this is a question just came to my mind while you were saying about the civic rights and the religious rights.
This program does from time to time like to find out what goes on behind the closed doors of this country. And we're lucky because, Don, you were there. You were behind the closed doors that were, you know, at the ground level trying to figure out what this office should do. The government asked for your advice. What'd you tell them?
Not much more than I've already expressed here.
Okay, then tell us about the much more.
And I'll also say that, you know, Alex and I have been together behind other closed-door consultations with Foreign Affairs, and Alex has participated in some that I would have liked to have attended, but realized that there are only so many spaces in any given room, and it depends what the subject matter is, and I'm not sure how they decide who they'd like to have there. Some of the other advice that was given was that the office would remain within a human rights context, and the office would create something that's been missing in the existing human rights context within the Department of Foreign Affairs. Alex would know well that we work with people who are referred to as desk officers, who have responsibility within Foreign Affairs for different geographic regions to give oversight, prepare reports, those kinds of things. But those people are employed in government where they write competitions and seek promotions, and they move frequently. Here, what we have the opportunity for is one-stop shopping, where there can be one email address for the Office of Religious Freedom to deal with what historically has been a very significant human rights issue that has not been adequately addressed through the Department of Foreign Affairs.
Let me follow up with Alex on that. Are you satisfied, based on what you know, that in fact human rights, which is after all right in your wheelhouse, is the focus of what this office is supposed to be about?
We don't have that information yet, I have to say, because it's not being shared publicly. It's reassuring to hear that the conversation is taking place, that people are making those suggestions. But, and this isn't about whether or not I was on the guest list. I'm not lobbying for that in particular. I am concerned, though, that our understanding is that there did not seem to be some selection of clear human rights experts who have been brought in at some point or are being actively consulted right now, because I think we need to see some very clear, diligent attention to the human rights side of this. it's a critical time. The mission is being developed. The working methods are coming together. The first decisions are going to be made soon, obviously, about priority countries or themes. And we would be disappointed if this opportunity to really ground it in a solid human rights approach doesn't come to fruition.
Some of you may have seen one of our guests writing in the Globe and Mail about this a couple of weeks ago. Clifford Orwin, I'm going to share a little snippet of that column with you and our viewers and our fellow guests on the program, and then come back with a question. Michael, if you would. There's a lot of careless invocation these days of separation of church and state, Clifford Orwin wrote. This isn't a Canadian doctrine, and is only very dubiously an American one. In recent years, U.S. courts and scholars have offered a more nuanced view of permissible cooperation between the state and faith-based organizations to achieve legitimate secular ends, such as education and social welfare. Even if you adopt this term as your mantra, however, it doesn't preclude a public stand on behalf of religious freedom. On the contrary, it implies one. Why does it imply one?
Because separation of church and state originally came into being as a means to securing religious freedom.
In the States?
No, in 17th century England.
Oh, okay.
And transferred therefrom to the States.
But it's not in their constitution?
No, well, they don't quite have a constitution.
In the United States?
No, I'm sorry. No, you mean the phrase separation of
Yes.
church and state is not in the American Constitution. Right. No, there's the First Amendment, which does not include that phrase. That's quite right. And my own feeling, and the feeling again of many scholars, is that separation of church and state has been overinterpreted and over-radicalized as making impossible legitimate cooperation between the state and religious organizations in pursuit of legitimate secular ends. That's what's it about. But that cooperation has to be in the service of legitimate secular ends, not religious or sectarian ones.
Brian, can you help us on this? When the Clinton administration tried to set this thing up, I guess, I don't know, was it 10, 15 years ago? Oh, it'd be more than that now. Yeah. Anyway, when they did these issues of, are we mixing up church and state here come up? And if so, how do they deal with them?
Yeah, it came up in the context of whether this was really aimed to help one religion above other religious groups. And in the process of debating this, it went through a number of different versions, and then the version that was finally passed was aimed at protecting religious freedom for all groups around the world. So there was some discussion, but I think one of the things that moved it from a debate to a policy that was adopted was that so many different faith groups got behind it and supported the idea. And there wasn't a debate among religious groups whether this was important, and I think that helped the policy make its way through the U.S. system.
We've had a perfectly civilized discussion about this, but now I want to get into some Craven politics here, and that is, and Alex, why don't I start with you on this? I haven't heard anybody yet allege that the Harper government is putting this in place in a kind of a cynical bid to curry favor with its assumed religious base in the Conservative Party. Alex, do you think that motivation is a piece of this?
Well, obviously many have made that suggestion, especially given that it came up in the context of an election campaign. But I'm not going to go there, because we are approaching this as something that's useful and important. As I began by saying, religious persecution is a crucial human rights issue. We do have some questions and cautionary notes about how it's going forward, and really wanting to be sure that it's as diverse as it needs to be, that it's as rights regarding as it has to be. I think that's where our focus needs to be right now.
Okay. Wahida, any issues there?
I think that other than that, what I've just said, that the process itself is flawed because of exclusion of certain groups within our own society.
But what about the currying favor for political purposes?
I mean, it's hard to really prove whether that was exactly targeted or not, so I really don't have much to say on that issue, really.
Don, you going to go there?
The Evangelical Fellowship of Canada has been advocating for this type of an office for over a decade, along with many other organizations that are involved with people who are persecuted because of their faith on the ground in other countries. So this has been a developing process. Also, I think we've seen in some very clear statements from the Prime Minister and from Minister Kenney in particular, the impact that Shahbaz Bhatti, who was the Minister for Minorities in Pakistan, had on them visiting Canada just weeks before he was martyred for his personal beliefs and for his standing up for minorities in Pakistan.
We should just explain it. I think members of the Canadian government urged him not to go back to Pakistan, knowing what was waiting for him, and yet he insisted on going back anyway.
And I met with Shahbaz the night before he went back to Pakistan, and he said at that time that he had been offered the opportunity to remain in Canada and in the United States, that he had been offered security by the Canadian and the American governments for the great work that he was undertaking in Pakistan.
Felt he had to be with his people.
And that he said that as a man who had a personal deep faith in Jesus Christ, he was not going to run from the danger that was ahead of him, nor was he going to abandon the people who were depending upon him.
And it's very moving, but here Shia are targeted in Pakistan, we know that. And yet there's no Shia representation in the consultation process, and I know that for a fact. How do we then explain that? I mean, I felt very bad also what has happened in Pakistan.
What do you think the explanation is, though?
I mean, I'm lost. I have no idea.
Well, you know what people say, the Shia don't vote for the Conservatives, so they weren't invited. That's the allegation.
Well, this is sad. I read that. I mean, read a couple of articles that they were saying that these are the groups who don't overwhelmingly vote for Mr. Harper, so that's why they were excluded. But this is what I'm saying is our inconsistencies will make this project a failure.
Well, just before we go there then, I got about a minute left here and I want to go to Clifford, because before we say it's a failure, let me ask whether, is it no longer possible for any country to enforce its liberal democratic values and principles without the cooperation of faith-based groups?
I don't know if that would be true generally across the board, but I suspect that it would be true in matters of religion.
Okay, but not across the board.
Well, yeah, not on every issue, although obviously the support of faith-based organizations would be very useful on every issue. I mean, my feeling about the last question you asked is that we shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth by questioning the Harper government's motives. If in fact they are playing to a domestic religious constituency, that just points to the fact that we should all celebrate that the wide range of Canadian domestic religious constituencies, they're all liberal religions that have a strong commitment to freedom of religion. And on this question of consultation, certainly they should remedy their original error by bringing in and consulting even groups that didn't vote Tory on the premise that if consulted by the Tories, they may be more likely to vote Tory next time. So someone should give the Harper government that good advice.
I think you just did. Can I thank all of our participants in today's program? Brian Grimm in Washington, D.C. from the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life. Alex Neve in Ottawa, the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada. Thanks, you two, for being there on the line for us in the American and Canadian capitals, respectively. Clifford Orwin, whom I always like because he always pauses before answering. He thinks about the question before he gives an answer. I always like that about you. And Wahida Valianti from the Canadian Islamic Congress. Thanks so much on that side of the table. Don Hutchinson, Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Many thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.